Okay, and we are going to begin here in just probably 1 minute. So thanks for your patience.
Of course.
Okay. Well, let's go ahead and get started. For those attending live and watching us streaming, thanks so much for joining us. This is the second day of the 2023 International E-Conference on Holocaust Memory. And our focus in this conference is on the aesthetics and art of communicating Holocaust memory and communicating the stories of Holocaust survivors. So thank you so much for joining us. I am very pleased to be able to introduce our next presenter, who will be presenting on photography and Auschwitz. So Kästle van der Meer is a graduate of the History Master of Arts program at the University of Victoria in British Columbia. Her primary area of study is gender and sexuality in the Holocaust, and her MA thesis investigated Jewish resistance to sexualized violence in Nazi-forced concentration camps. Now, Kästle's other research interests include representations of Holocaust memorials in photographs and on social media. She currently teaches as a sessional lecturer in the Division of Continuing Studies, as well as the Academic and Technical Writing Program at the University of Victoria. And we're very lucky to have her. So thank you so much for doing this presentation. I will hand it over to you. The floor is yours.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I'm just going to share my screen here. Okay. There we go. Yeah, so today I'm going to be presenting a paper that I wrote after a trip to Auschwitz that I took this past June. So let me get started. So when the Holocaust is mentioned, one site in particular usually always comes to mind, and that's Auschwitz. The camp complex has been memorialized in countless photos and has become really emblematic of the horrors of the Nazi regime. Entire books have been written about Auschwitz, and scholars have dedicated their careers to studying the camp complex. And in June 2023, I visited the Auschwitz-Birkenau Memorial Museum for the first time. While I could write an entire book about my experience at the site, in the interest of time, I'm just going to offer my reflections on photography at the Auschwitz camp complex. And my paper is guided by Susan Sontag's on photography, as well as contemporary studies of visitor photography at Auschwitz. So in this presentation, I'm going to unpack my approach to photographing the site, including my apprehension about whether or not to do so, and debate the necessity of photographing Auschwitz as a visitor and the value of visitors' photographs to collective memory. And I'm going to argue for the productive capability of these photos. So photography gives those holding a camera the power to capture memories, and that's what's always kind of drawn me to the practice. So my fascination with photography really began with the realization that photos have the ability to capture moments in time that would otherwise be forgotten. While photographs are tied to memory, looking at photos of the past doesn't necessarily equate to remembering it. So photographs facilitate the transmission of memory, both communicative and collective, as it passes from one generation to another. Viewing a photograph, even if we're not there when it was taken, helps to maintain the memory of an event or a place or a time. The distinct quality of photographs to transmit memory is what makes them such a crucial factor in Holocaust remembrance. As Marianne Hirsch argues, such photos facilitate post-memory, or the communication of traumatic memory from one generation to the next. And according to Hirsch, photos imbued with traumatic meaning, such as those of Nazi camps, can not only help us process traumatic events such as the Holocaust, but also spur action on the part of younger generations. So while scholars in memory studies often draw on photography to illustrate the transmission of Holocaust memory, not very much has been written about photography by visitors to sites of Holocaust remembrance, such as Auschwitz. And while there's an emerging body of work that looks at representations of the Holocaust by visitors on social media, very little research has been done investigating how visitors' photos are used kind of outside these purposes. I argue that it's important to study how the memory of the Holocaust is engaged with through photos in order to understand how the memory is being transmitted in the digital age and amongst younger generations. And questioning my own motivation for photographing Auschwitz when I visited kind of brought me to the topic of this paper. So prior to visiting the Auschwitz-Birkenau Memorial Museum, I found myself really apprehensive about taking pictures of a site where over 1 million people died. Although the memorial encourages photography and asks visitors to share their photos, I wondered what purpose my photos really would serve. Like, even if I use them to educate others in my career, was it really necessary to have my own pictures of this site when thousands of photos, potentially millions of photos, already exist? So this was a question that kind of guided my approach to entering the site. As a first-time visitor, I had only ever seen Auschwitz in photographs before I visited. And while these images really helped me better understand the horrors of the camp, I wasn't sure that taking my own photos would serve a purpose other than confirm that I'd been to the site. I told myself that these photographs, if I chose to take them, would let me reflect on my experience visiting Auschwitz, but I wondered if I really needed photos to do so. Certainly one would remember their first visit to Auschwitz. So as I kind of researched, I realized that I was not alone in this discomfort. In his 2019 study of visitor photographs at Auschwitz, Thomas Thurnell Reed describes one visitor who saw photographs as a problematic yet necessary part of her experience of Auschwitz. And similarly, Till Hilmar notes in his 2016 investigation of visitor photography that many visitors to Auschwitz have a bad conscience about taking pictures of the site. I also noticed that in my own conversations with colleagues that I traveled to the site with, that many of us were uneasy about how to photograph the site, which was interesting because we all had backgrounds in Holocaust and history. So no matter how much thinking and talking and research I did, I really couldn't shake this feeling of discomfort when imagining taking photos here, and I really wanted to interrogate that further. So Thurnell Reed and Hilmar argue that some visitors' unease around photography at Auschwitz can be attributed to a lack of certainty regarding respectful behavior at the site. But for me, the primary reason that I was hesitant to take photos is that I really wanted to bear witness to the atrocities committed at Auschwitz, first and foremost through my eyes rather than through a lens. A camera lens has the ability to put distance between the photographer and their subject. And I really wanted to avoid that. So in her 1977 book of essays reflecting on photography and its impact on society, Susan Sontag kind of elaborates on this concept. She writes that a way of certifying experience, taking photographs is also a way of refusing it. By limiting experience to a search for the photogenic, by converting experience into an image, a souvenir. So in one sense, we might consider that a photograph holds memories for the photographer and allows them to filter their experiences and hold on to only the most profound memories, while relying on the photo to inspire memories later when they refer back to it. In preparing to visit Auschwitz, I was concerned that photographing the site would inadvertently lead me to distance myself from the experience of actually being at the site, which is something that many visitors fear. My discomfort also stemmed from the fact that my very first visit to a camp when I was 16, really shaped my experience of photography. So I visited other camps since, but preparing to enter Auschwitz, which is this emblematic symbol of the Holocaust, caused me to reflect on my very first visit to a camp. When I visited Sachsenhausen, which is a former concentration camp in Oranienburg, Germany, I took my camera, but I was so stunned and overcome with emotion that it just felt so wrong to take photos. And so as I prepared to enter Auschwitz, I wondered if I would encounter the same feeling. And so I really wanted to reflect on the fact that a decade later, when I'm at this profound site, how would I feel? Since the first time I visited a camp, which was Sachsenhausen a decade ago, I've completed 2 degrees in history with a focus on the Holocaust. I've spoken with survivors. I've analyzed hundreds of testimonies and visited multiple other camps. And so I wondered if the knowledge and experience that I gained would kind of make me feel different about photographing the site. So when I entered Auschwitz on the first day of a 2-day tour, I was unsure about whether or not I was going to take photos of the site. I didn't know how I'd feel. And I thought I'd kind of make my decision in the moment. So after passing through security, we met our tour guide who invited us to take photos of anything in the camp, except in the designated areas where no photos are allowed. And she requested that we avoid taking selfies. Very shortly after the tour began, I realized how fast it would be, and made the decision somewhat suddenly to capture the camp with my camera. And I was really surprised to see that taking photos felt less invasive than at other camps I'd been to, especially Sachsenhausen. And I think this is in part because of the busyness of Auschwitz. So it's touted as a must-see tourist location across Poland, and crowds are omnipresent at Auschwitz. And for most of our tour, my group was surrounded by other guided groups, many of whom were taking photos, which made it feel much less strange to do it myself. And I think taking photos at the site also felt less problematic because I'd seen so many photos of Auschwitz prior to my visit. So the fact that Auschwitz has become representative of Nazi atrocity plays a role in its popularity as a tourist attraction, as well as the resulting photos taken by visitors. As Marianne Hirsch notes, popular representations of the Holocaust have comprised of the very same few images used over and over again, iconically and emblematically. And many of these images, which Hirsch refers to as tropes for Holocaust memory, are of Auschwitz. So in a sense, the countless photographic representations of the camp kind of imply a permission to photograph amongst visitors by granting a sense of familiarity ahead of the visit. Before visiting, I had viewed hundreds and probably thousands of photos of Auschwitz, and being exposed to these figures or these photos allowed me to form a mental picture of the camp years before I stepped inside. In contrast, prior to visiting Sachsenhausen when I was a teenager, the only photos I'd seen were those on the memorial's website, which I looked at briefly before visiting. So the image I had in my mind of the camp was very malleable and primed to be formed based on my experience, rather than a narrative about the site or a trope of Holocaust memory. So in part because viewing photos summons the memory, which is often collective, associated with an image, Susan Sontag observes that often something disturbs us more in photograph form than it does when we actually experience it. And I think this was certainly true with Auschwitz. Before visiting in photos of the camp, I could almost feel the violence beneath the surface of photos. It was very clear that Auschwitz was a place of death and destruction, and a lot of representations, whether they're contemporary or historical, represent all of the horrors that happened, even if those horrors weren't immediately clear in the photo. But then when I was at Auschwitz, the site felt uncannily calm and was almost unrepresentative of photos I'd seen of Auschwitz. So this disconnect between expectation and reality that I experienced is examined by many scholars, including Till Hilmar, who argues that it's a common phenomenon for visitors to experience this because they expect to remember their visit. And so when they enter the site and it doesn't match up to their expectation, it's pretty jarring. So as Hilmar points out, visitors to Auschwitz expect an authentic historical experience. But this expectation usually, among some, turns to disappointment as visitors are kind of enveloped by crowds and whisked away on a tour. And the realization that a trip to Auschwitz includes the banality found at many tourist attractions, so crowds queuing up waiting for entry, security checks, a guided tour with an audio headset. This shatters the romanticized version of the experience that's been built up by multiple representations of Auschwitz in popular culture, historical films, and photographs. This process is not really part of the expected historical experience of the camp, and therefore is not included in many contemporary accounts of a visit to Auschwitz. So as a result, it's left out of our collective understanding of what a visit to Auschwitz entails, even if we're aware that we have to go through the proceedings in order to enter the camp. Interestingly, this entry process kind of made taking photos feel less uncomfortable. I almost felt as if the proximity to other contemporary tourist experiences kind of eased the distance between the outside world and what was inside the camp, which I found very interesting and slightly alarming. And so in order to reconcile their experiences or their expectations with reality, Hilmar notes that visitors to Auschwitz often find a way to relate to the past of the site by recognizing something that looks familiar to the way that they imagined it to actually be. And this is one of the reasons why visitors take photos of the camp at locations that are deemed iconic. Though I experienced surprise at how I felt rather than disappointment, I fell into this category of visitors, and I found myself taking photos to match the image in my head constructed from other photos that I'd seen. And I think I did so in an attempt to kind of comprehend the surreality of the experience. So although I entered Auschwitz armed with more knowledge about the site than the average visitor, I was still haunted by my experience and reacted the same way that some with a less thorough understanding of the Holocaust might react. I was really stunned, and I took photos of things that I recognized to kind of make sense of it. In her Muses on Photography and Tourism, Sontag notes that photography fills a void that presents itself when tourists don't know how to react to what they're seeing. So photography is essentially a way that many visitors to the camp reconcile their reaction to their surroundings. As Daniel P. Reynolds writes in his 2018 study of Holocaust tourism's impact on collective memory, reaching for the camera is a frequent response, an effort to reassert some sense of perspective or agency in the face of overwhelming brutality. If the mind simply shuts down in the face of such enormity, perhaps the camera becomes a way to postpone the engagement, to save the image for another time and place when contemplation may be more possible. So in cases where our brains don't really know how to react to what we're seeing, sorry, lost my spot here. Reynolds argues that photos can be used as a vehicle for later reflection. So while the camera can separate the self from the subject, Sontag also notes that the camera can act as the device that makes real what one is experiencing. So in this way, separating themselves from what they see via the act of taking photos can help visitors such as myself process the experience. While I was aware that I was unable to fully process the feeling of being at Auschwitz while I was there, I took photos to reflect on my experience at a later date, despite my initial fear of kind of distancing myself from what I saw by taking photographs. It's also worth noting that viewing photographs to prompt one's reflection on their time at the memorial can be productive on more than just an individual scale. So Reynolds argued that reflection is memory work, which kind of requires visitors to think beyond the passivity of viewership and instead kind of consider their own relationship to violence and ultimately to change behaviors that contribute to it. So this reflection might start with asking ourselves why we choose to take a given photo. And I asked myself this as I took photos of some of the most well-known areas in Auschwitz I and Birkenau. Although I wasn't sure why I was doing so, it almost felt necessary. And many visitors to Auschwitz take photos in a manner that replicates those they've already seen. Imogen Dalziel suggests that the familiarity of these sites might even provide visitors to the museum with a sense of reassurance, having seen them so many times before, and grant a form of subconscious permission to photograph them. So even with the amount of consideration I gave to photographing the site before I visited, I experienced this firsthand and found myself photographing different sites that I'd seen 100 times over. So the wrought iron gate emblazoned with Arbeit macht frei, the railroad tracks leading into Birkenau that you can see on the screen, the barbed wire fence around the camp. But I was surprised that these photos I took didn't turn out to be replicas of photos I'd already seen. So photographers make many decisions before they take a photo. Obviously, what to photograph is one of those decisions, but they also have to make choices regarding angles, exposure, flash, and other aesthetics. So a photo can be seen as a reflection of the photographer and the meaning that they impose on a given site. In choosing to capture Auschwitz a certain way, we assign a certain meaning to our photos based on the memory that we kind of assume it to hold. And if we consider the photographer's exercise agency in the act of photography and that this act can be productive, the question becomes kind of not whether to photograph Auschwitz, but what to photograph there. And this question leads us to another. Is one part of Auschwitz more worthy of a photo and thus of remembrance than another? In choosing to photograph only certain areas of the camp, such as these iconic kind of images, we're kind of implicitly answering yes. But if visitors photograph every part of the camp, I wonder if there might be a saturation point reached where photographs lose all meaning. Scholars have expressed concern that the proliferation of photos of Auschwitz has led to a banal familiarity with Holocaust imagery and, by extension, the genocide itself. Hirsch argues, for instance, that the proliferation of iconic Holocaust images has resulted in a loss of context around what is represented in the photos. But Hilmar suggests the resulting emptiness at these sites can actually be productive. So in taking their own iconic images of Auschwitz and representing these photographs, visitors can express their own thoughts and feelings and views on what they see and better reflect on their experience when they return home and they have some distance and some space between what they've seen. And this reflection is crucial because it holds the capacity to translate into action. So though I took photos of iconic parts of the camp, my photos varied from those I'd seen in various ways because of the size of the tour and the pace. No matter how hard I tried, there was always people in the frame of my photos. And I had to ask myself why I was trying to represent Auschwitz as devoid of life and kind of empty. And this desire is not uncommon amongst visitors and stems from a desire to kind of capture the site as we envision it in our collective memory. However, photography doesn't necessarily depict historical truth, but kind of our complicated relationship to the past. So visiting Auschwitz is an act of post-memory, and the way that visitors view it today will never be the same as when it was a functioning camp. As hard as we can try, we're not going to replicate the camp the same as when it was functioning for its intended use, even in photographic form. And so visitors, when they visit Auschwitz, are not going to see this. The Auschwitz-Birkenau Memorial Museum is just what it suggests, a place to learn, to reflect, and to remember. So while I took iconic images, I also took pictures of what I found to be surreal to match the feeling of being at the site. For instance, when I was in the Guards Watchtower Birkenau, I saw a picture of a bus, which you can see on the right-hand side of the slide here, bringing people to Birkenau, just paces away from the main rail tracks leading into the camp. And it really seemed to me to kind of encapsulate the surreality of being at this site. I also took a picture of a chocolate bar that was right outside of one of the children's barracks. And I found this disturbing because not only were food and drink not allowed in Birkenau, this barrack housed hundreds of starving children, and to see a chocolate bar just discarded outside was very alarming. And although I remember feeling repulsed when I saw it, I had actually forgotten about seeing this Milka bar outside of the barrack until I was reviewing my photos a couple months after visiting the camp. And I think that this is a testament to the power of photos to help us remember. Okay. So photographs never expire. They live on long past human life ceases. And in this way, taking a photograph at Auschwitz is a more tangible way to bear witness and keep the memory of the Holocaust alive. But I'm not sure if it's more tangible than viewing it through our own eyes. In reflecting back on my time at Sachsenhausen a decade ago, what I remember is not any specific part of the camp, but the solemnity of the place and the heaviness that the air seemed to hold. But what I remember most is that my experience there left me hungry for more answers about how hatred for one group of humans could reach the point of genocide. A decade and a half ago, Marianne Hirsch asked whether the memory of the genocide could be transformed into action and resistance. Like Hirsch, I believe that it can. My visit to Sachsenhausen was an act of remembrance, and though I didn't take any photos, it developed into a desire to keep the memory of the Holocaust alive, and a career that I've dedicated to studying Jewish resistance to sexualized violence, a form of violence that nearly 80 years after liberation has only recently been given attention by scholars. In 10 years, I'm not sure how the photos that I took at Auschwitz will inform my memories of the visit or how I will have used them to maintain the memory of the Holocaust. But I do know that this visit inspired me to undertake research on the role of visitor photographs to the Holocaust, to Holocaust education at a more grassroots level. It's very unlikely that visitor photography at Auschwitz and other Nazi camps will cease in the near future. So it seems logical to turn to a question of how photos taken at these sites can be used to further Holocaust remembrance and educate future generations. I'm interested in answering this question and also in looking at how visitor photography at Nazi camps has changed with the democratization of photography through the proliferation of the smartphone. So although the decision to photograph is still deliberate, it almost feels less so in an age when everyone is equipped with a smartphone and unlimited cloud storage. So how does this impact our representations of the Holocaust through photos? I'm also interested in questions such as how is the Holocaust represented on social media? What does it mean to represent the Holocaust through images, especially if those images are represented online? So in discussing some of the reasons for and behind visitor photography at Auschwitz, I've kind of attempted to grapple with my own visit to the camp and consider how I can use my experience and my photos to educate others. I argue that taking photos is a way of not only bearing witness to the atrocities that occurred in the Holocaust, but also a potentially productive act, as reflection can spur action on the part of those who visit the camp. However, I think in order to fully benefit from a visit to a former camp, reflecting on one's photographs is one way to engage with this history, but I also think that visitors need to combine their experience with other types of learning, such as engaging with survivor testimony, further educating themselves on the Holocaust, challenging contemporary anti-Semitism, and combining all of this with a reflection on their experience and what they've seen. I think only through a combination of these different types of engagement can the history of the Holocaust and the history of Auschwitz really be grappled with. So thank you very much for listening. And I look forward to any questions that you might have.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you. One, I could tell that you put a ton of thought into some of the ethical concerns and a lot of the philosophical, what is the point of even doing so? And I love that. I was actually kind of chuckling to myself going, man, historians, philosophers, just, academics in general can really tease out the most nuanced stuff about things that nobody else would ever think of, such as taking photographs at Auschwitz. Is it ethical, and what purpose could that even serve? So congratulations on doing that. I love that. I want to first, you did mention that there are some sections of the concentration camps that you can't take photographs. What sections are those again, and why? What's the reasoning behind it?
Yeah, so at Auschwitz 1, the only sections that you're not permitted to take photos at are the inside of the gas chambers. And if I recall correctly, our guide said that that is a choice that is usually up to the guide. So not every guide makes that decision, but that's what she deemed most respectful, and I agree. And then the other area is in one of the barracks, there's displays of the hair of some of the victims, as well as prosthetics and some other belongings like suitcases, shoes. And the hair and I believe it is the shoes you're not permitted to take pictures of because that can lead to damage. So they've got certain filters on the window that prevent light from coming in. And the idea there is to preserve it for as long as possible. So those are the two areas.
Okay, that makes sense. The shoe and hair part, that makes perfect sense. Tell me your rationale. What is your line of reasoning that it is inappropriate to take photos inside the gas chambers? Why did you come to that conclusion?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think about this and I wonder, I've obviously done a lot of thinking about the ethics of it, and I think I'm still thinking through it. If our guide had not told us not to take photos, um, would I have not taken photos? I think about. Um, I My rationale behind that is, it's hard to articulate, especially in writing, but when you're at these places, entering these sites of death, there's this feeling that kind of overcomes you. It's quite chilling, and I think it's present throughout the grounds and any camp that I've experienced. But when you enter a gas chamber, and you see the scratches on the wall, uh, it feels as if, it's not really necessary to take photos because it's such a profound feeling. But at the same time, you kind of wonder, why am I taking a picture of a site where all of these people died? Um, I'm still kind of articulating it in my head and going like, why is it okay to take pictures here and not here? But I think it comes down to the way that it's just the feeling of being in that site and um, you know, I, I think I'm still articulating it. But
Yeah.
that's about as yeah, it's a feeling that kind of overcomes you and um you wonder really, is it necessary? Yeah.
Well, immediately words that come to mind for me is solemnity and gravity. The solemn nature, it's almost a sacred place, even in a secular sense. It's hallowed ground. And the gravity of what happened there historically, you run the risk of perhaps trivializing it or sensationalizing it. And I think that for me at least, that I can easily imagine that would be the case for me. I remember a few years ago, a popular social media influencer was hiking in the some forest in Japan that is famous for people committing suicide, and you remember this case,
Mm.
and he had stumbled across somebody I think who had hanged themselves maybe,
Hmm.
and he videoed it. He took photos and even posted it. I don't think he even did it. I'm not sure he did anything disrespectful. But just by showing images, people thought how dishonoring to the gravity of what you're actually witnessing.
Hmm.
And yet, when we go to Holocaust museums and whatnot, you will see videos and photographs of corpses being piled on top of each other. Isn't that the point?
Hmm.
But then again, I mean, that's clear raw footage. So maybe it's of a different beast. Um, the other thing I wanted to ask, and then I can open it up to general Q&A. Um, how much do you think that narcissistic self-centeredness kind of comes into play? And what I'm specifically referring to, especially with selfies, but we now recognize that people who are constantly taking pictures of themselves and posting things about themselves on social media does seem to put an uptick in narcissistic tendencies and whatnot. And it does seem to happen predominantly among women lately, is what the studies are showing so far. Do you find that perhaps some of your um, resistance to the idea of taking photos is because you don't want to, is the potential that it's now about you and not about the whole.
Yeah, I think that's probably a big part of it because when I was, when I was thinking about I'm going to be visiting this place and I've studied this for so long and I've listened to all these stories and it's, so it looms so large in the historical imagination. My thought was kind of like, why do I need my own photos of this? Like, why do I need them on my laptop? Obviously to reflect and to look back, but that seems like a very kind of like a self-centered thing. And so I think you're right that part of it, when I think about it, I'm also interested in the whole social media side of it and how people represent that on, images on social media. And yeah, I think part of it is kind of like, why do I think my images are any more special or necessary than any other photos? And, I'm still kind of wondering and, it's still a big question. And I've realized I've done a lot more thinking about this than the average person. Even my colleagues that I was traveling with, they were like, Kästle, shut up. There's so, you just need to like, get over it. But I do think there's this kind of fear of like placing yourself at the center and, even doing all this thinking about me as the photographer. I'm like, you're still centering yourself somehow. When the broader question should be, I think focused on the memory of the Holocaust, which I'm still thinking about, but yeah.
And I think you're right to make a distinction that we do this naturally. There are solemn and sanctified, sacred sites. This isn't your everyday, I'm posting a selfie of me at the club. So yeah, I think there's an inherent difference, which should cause us to pause and say, should there also be a boundary?
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Honest, I saw you had something. Please go for it.
Yeah, hi. Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm not sure how to pronounce your name.
Kästle.
Kathleen. Okay. Hi. Very interesting reflections and topic, and I wanted to share a little bit about things that I had in Auschwitz, and maybe to offer a few directions. So I think I visited Auschwitz in the early 2000, when it was, I think, my first time having a digital camera, not smartphone yet. And it was my first time actually using it. And I remember taking pictures there, but I also know for sure that I never went back to look at them. And still now, until now, I have all the pictures like saved somewhere, but I never go back to look at them.
Interesting.
And I remember being in the place and feeling so distant from the place because it felt, I think my mind could not grasp it. So I'm third generation Holocaust survivor from both sides, and part of my family was actually perished in Auschwitz. And I just could not grasp of where I'm actually walking, what I'm actually seeing. I did take pictures, but I felt at the moment that it's useless. I wasn't sure what to do with myself. I wasn't sure how to understand where I'm at. You hear about Auschwitz so much time, but when you're there, you're just not sure even what to do with your being there. So this was my experience. And I remember at the time that it felt so weird to see people standing under the Arbeit macht frei, and taking pictures of asking people to take pictures of themselves, of them, like under. And so first, I appreciate very much this paper, and when you're done, I would love to have it taught in my class. I teach on anti-Semitism. Yeah, so remember me and send it to me.
Oh my gosh,
it sounds very, very interesting. I wanted to offer a few things because I also worked on photography, by the way, in some of my work. I think there is something interesting in the intersection between authenticity of aura, Walter Benjamin term, and the idea if the aura is actually ruined through photography or is created through photography. So there is, and I agree with Dr. Slade about trivialization. So there is something, I think, in the intersection of authenticity, trivialization, the aura, that it's, I think, interesting to realize if the photography creates it or actually, I don't know, if distracts it or ruins it. And I think a lot, and probably this, what is the site also encourages you to take pictures, is about the Holocaust denial thing. Because there is kind of an understanding that as time passes by, we're seeing more and more of denial perspectives, approaches, messages. For instance, with the gas chambers and what Deborah Lipstadt needed to deal with back in the time. It was specifically about Auschwitz and about the idea of gas chambers that did not exist. So, so I think a lot would be interesting to unpack these things. But I think also that, and you said something, and you cited someone, and I cannot remember who was it, about feeling a sense of agency. So when you take a picture, you feel like you can cope with it, you can do something because you're being there in some sense. You're identify, I think, more with the victim than with the Nazis. And there is kind of a tendency to try to feel more active, to feel more that you control something, even if it's just your camera, that I think can be an interesting thing to think about. And I think also that the camera has something that, or the picture, or then even just a photograph that is not you in the picture, that connects you specifically to the Holocaust, to the place, to a moment or a place where you feel so distant from, so disconnected from. And for me to be in the place where my family practically was murdered, it was something that allowed me to connect somehow to them. So I don't know, these are just like a few things to offer. Not sure what you think about them, but
it's all great. Thank you for sharing. And it's most of those things. When I was there, I'm like, I'm writing notes. At the end of the, we had a 2-day tour, so I think we spent 8 or 10 hours total. At the end, I would like come and like write all these ideas, and I wanted to include so much of that in my paper, but I couldn't. But the part about connecting to the Holocaust is I think key too, because especially with regard to social media, I have a lot of thoughts about kind of putting these images on social media, because at first I'm like, this is appalling, like who's going to be uploading these pictures, especially selfies. But then I did more reading, and there's some scholars who kind of argue that in the context of we're moving farther away from this history, and a lot of younger people have no connection to it. Visiting the site and taking these photos is a way to connect to it. And so I'm still, I see what you mean, where, even if you're not in the image, taking it and having it is this connection that you can have. And if that's the only connection for some people that they might have to it, that's doing more than nothing. And so that's another, and I'm also just super interested in like, how do we engage young people in Holocaust history? Like if they don't find it something that they need to learn about, how do we bring them in? And so you just offered many great thoughts, and I'm looking into all of them. And I see Dr. Slade's put a whole bunch in the chat here, which is awesome.
Kästle, have you ever heard of performative remembrance?
A little bit. In one of my classes I teach, we talk a lot about performative activism, but we haven't had enough time to go into performative remembrance. And that's something where I'm like, this is great. There's so much to learn.
Well, I think that wraps up basically and encapsulates exactly what you're talking about. and I put this is what I have written on performative remembrance. So feel free to plagiarize it at your will. This is something I've written for my classes when we get talking about social media, and we do things like we discuss things like virtue signaling and
Mhm.
selectivism, where it just you purposely put on social media uh, an expression and an opinion that is trendy, but it's pretty artificial. You're just virtue signaling. And I get the sense that a lot of what you're talking about with people and their behavior at some of these places, or if they're posting photos online, it is performative.
Mhm.
And it is not, in fact, actually taking time to understand the gravity. So, if nothing else, I recommend that you copy, if you can, copy or take a screenshot of what I wrote in there in the chat box, and feel free to use it as you see fit.
That's great. I copy and paste it, and I will give you full credit. Don't worry. Awesome.
Unnecessary, but yeah, I think that's the big thing. The authenticity of the emotional responses. It just so happens, and this seems wildly one probably off topic and inappropriate, but I promise that it has some connection, at least in my brain. I was just having a discussion yesterday. There's the question of a domestic violence victim, an alleged domestic violence victim, had made a TikTok video of their alleged abuse. And one of the things that seemed very interesting is after posting, my partner put my head through a wall. She was taking a selfie of herself as if to broadcast. Now, aside from the fact that there weren't any marks or bruises that we could see, it seemed so odd for somebody who had just endured a very serious thing of domestic violence to make a TikTok video,
Mm-hmm.
or to take a selfie. It instantly, right or wrong, I don't know what the real story is with that, but instantly it communicates disingenuous emotion, disingenuous remembrance. So
Yeah. And that's what I think about too when I see, posting, and especially the selfie thing. It's like, what are you getting out of this? Is the question. And, some argue that, it's a way to connect. And I there's more to be learned there, I'm sure. I'm like just delving into this, but I think the authenticity is a huge part of it, where what makes you think that in order to engage with this, you have to display it to other people, I think is the big part. Um, yeah, there's a lot of different ways to go.
yeah, and I recognize, we all recognize that people learn and engage with things differently. I'm a very tactile person. I remember when I was going to doing archaeological stuff out in Israel and in Istanbul and seeing some of the sites, I had to touch everything. I absolutely loved touching it. It made it just so real and allowed me to embody it, if you will. But that doesn't mean I'm incapable of learning any other way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I get that some people are visual learners, or some people can learn by this or that, or they can't listen, they have to do or something.
Mm-hmm.
But you should all, especially for adults, I think you should probably learn some other skills too. So
Yeah, I think so too. And it makes me think, seeing people take these photos or take photos of themselves and post them. It's also interesting where, like, you know, if you take photos, and like the other part I find interesting is I take all my photos on a camera. And then I also, a big part of this paper that I cut out was what's the difference of having photos on my phone where I could put them on Insta? I mean, I would never, but it could just upload to Instagram versus camera, plug in the SD card, all of the steps. And I think part of the thing with posting these pictures too, and removing the authenticity is also just you post and then you kind of just move on. And you can have the images in your phone or on your laptop or whatever it might be, and they might just sit there. But I think there's part of it too with once it's posted and once it's kind of there and you're moving on to the next thing. That's kind of how we use social media. And so I'm also curious about how the process of posting, I wonder if it almost like halts and stops that process of reflection too. And yeah, I would love to interview people who, kind of engage in that and see like, what's going on there?
Yeah. Well, I can easily imagine somebody walking through the gas chamber. They come out crying. They are shook up from the emotional impact of it. And then
take a picture.
Well, yeah, then 20 seconds later, they take a picture up against one of the barracks or something.
Yeah.
And I'm a judgmental guy as it is anyway. So I'm sure I'm being overly judgmental of people. But it definitely seems, for me as an historian, I say the purpose of photography in a setting like this is to document the history. And as you had reiterated multiple times, it's been documented. Those photos exist. The photos of the place and the compound and every inch of that place has probably been photographed. You don't need to do it. You're not the journalist, uncovering for the first time a new site. And for me, I suspect that I would probably take a picture of myself at the entrance, not at the gate entrance, but at some other, whatever, I don't know, visitor center or whatever.
Yeah.
Just to document for me the historical event of me going there and put my stuff up. So, well, that's all I had. Any other thoughts or stuff that you'd like to explore?
I don't think so. That was great. Yeah, I appreciate the questions.
Excellent. Well, make sure you get Dr. Aranis's email if you haven't already seen it in the chat.
I will, yeah. I've got a copy and paste here.
And let me know when you have that.
I've got it. Perfect.
Okay. Well, thanks again for doing this presentation. I thought it was very enlightening and to my surprise, a much needed discussion to be had. So great job. Thank you for that. I will give it over to you for the last word.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss this research, and